Welcome to tonight's ICAA UVU lecture here at the UVU School of Architecture. We want to extend a special welcome to our speaker, Emily Utt. I will introduce her in just a minute, but let me just say a word about the ICAA. The Institute for Classical Architecture and Art is a national nonprofit that teaches history, teaches classical architecture in an effort to maintain a living tradition, a living building tradition and design tradition. We have a program here at Utah Valley University, which is also carrying on that tradition. My name is Paul Monson. I am both the president of the ICAA Utah chapter and the director of the program of architecture here at UVU. It is so good to be back in person. We haven't had an in-person lecture in a long time, since the PCE, the pre-COVID era, which feels like it's a long time ago. So it's great to be back in person. We're excited to have Emily Utt, and I hope that everyone on the Zoom call can hear and see the screen. If there's any issues or questions that you have, go ahead and type them into the chat. I'll ask Emily, would you prefer questions to be held to the end, or do you want people to just interrupt and shout things?
Yeah, well, shout them and I may ignore them. Say, no, hold that one, we'll come back in 5 minutes. Yeah.
So we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. Let me introduce our speaker, Emily Utt. She is a historic sites curator in the Church History Department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Her work focuses on the rich architectural legacy of the Latter-day Saint movement. Emily's involved in preservation projects at sacred sites across the country and around the world, including temples and meeting houses. She's also involved in ongoing restoration projects at historic sites in Palmyra, Kirtland, Nauvoo, and other locations. In any given week, you may find Emily in a hard hat at a construction site, hunting out a historical source in the archives, or collaborating with various partners on how to tell the stories of our built environment. Please join me in welcoming Emily Utt.
I was hoping Paul would tell us, some anecdote about some project we worked on. And
we'll save that.
We'll save that for the roast after. So I've known Paul a long time. We have been in the trenches together. So when he calls and says, "Can you do this?" You're like, "Yes, I do this for my people." So as Paul and I were talking, it started really about the Greek revival architecture in Utah. But as I got into this, it became more about early classicism in Utah and how Latter-day Saints and other early settlers are thinking about their architecture and their built environment. And I have to start with a few things that you need to know. I especially need to thank Tom Carter, Peter Goss, Laurie Bryant, Corey Jensen, Kirk Huffaker, and the late, great Paul Anderson, who have done much of the field plowing of architecture in Utah. If you do not own a copy of Tom Carter and Peter Goss's survey of Utah's historic architecture, go find one, buy one, use it every day. Other books that I would really recommend are Tom Carter's Building Zion, the Interior World of Mormon Settlement, which is really a study of the built environment and the world of Sanpete County, which is fascinating. And then Laurie Bryant wrote a book called A Modest Homestead, Life in Small Adobe Homes in Salt Lake City. And her work covers from 1850 to 1897. So it's focused on the little houses we live in Salt Lake. So I'm going to say this disclaimer: if I get anything right tonight, it's because of the people I just listed and the work that they do and the mentoring and experience that I've had working with them for many years. Anything I get wrong is entirely my fault. And if I get something really wrong, you will hear Tom yelling through the camera at me to correct myself, because he's wonderful and good that way. So let's start with very basic. What is classicism? Is that a good intro to the topic? So we're going to talk tonight about architecture in Utah during this early settlement period, basically roughly 1847 to 1870. So we're going to talk about three primary ideas. What is classicism? Why use it? and how this sense of classicism was achieved in early Utah. Why was it used so frequently in early Utah? And how did the ideals of those styles play out on this early Utah landscape? We'll be talking less about the specific elements of the style and which buildings in Utah are the purest examples, which architectural critics like to do, and more about the worldview that created and used certain architectural languages and why they use those languages. So what is classicism? I just pulled a couple of images from Virginia McAllister's almost Bible of vernacular architecture in the United States. A field guide to American houses. Again, if you don't own a copy, go get it. So there's a couple of typical details that pull up in these early kind of federal and Greek revival styles, which are really what happens in Utah. You have a strong sense of symmetry. You have a low pitch gable roof. You'll often have a wide and decorative cornice. You'll have cornice returns, or you'll have a full entablature running across the gable end of your building. You'll have columns holding up porches. You'll have pilasters, more on the federal side. You'll find Palladian arches, more common on the federal revival side, sometimes in windows, sometimes above doors. You're more often to find trabeated transom windows at the door in the Greek revival. And you are more likely to find as a trabeated flat window opening. So, and again, there's a billion variations in this. There's, every idea you can come up with is going to come out of these two styles, but you'll find these basic details repeated throughout these federal and Greek revival styles in early Utah. So let's talk about why. Why would this happen in the United States, and why would it happen specifically in Utah? There's a lot of reasons for this, and I've just kind of brainstormed a few in the last few weeks. And I know I probably missed some and I might be giving too much attention to others, but here's a few reasons why I came up with. One reason for me was expediency. The first wave of settlers arriving in 1847 knew that about 11,000 people were coming after them in the next 3 years, and that about 70,000 people would be in Utah by 1870. The few scattered sites and use by fur traders were insufficient to manage the needs of that many people. And these early settlers were not going to mingle with Native Americans already in the areas they laid out in their communities. Things needed to happen, and they needed to happen fast. There wasn't time to sort out a new way of living that integrated well into the local landscape. There wasn't time to philosophize about which style of architecture appealed to their sensibilities and which, city plan was the plan. They had to draw on what they knew and had brought with them already as they settled in the many valleys of Utah. Classicism was a language familiar to them in its many varieties from the towns that they had come from. And so they didn't have to sit around for 3 years debating, what do we do next? Another reason perhaps is a desire to impose some kind of order out of the perceived chaos of this place. To these early settlers, these places seemed wild and savage. Imposing rationality on this place would civilize it. For example, St. George clerk James Blake described the area this way. In some ancient period, the south rim of the Great Basin was a series of burning volcanoes, immense streams of lava running down the mountainsides and rivers of liquid fire, filled to overflowing the canyons and deep gorges with which the mountainsides were created. The lava, cooling, broke into fragments. The winds and floods continued their wear upon the soft mountain soil till they were carried away, and what mountain spurs have become deep valleys bounded on each side by high ridges. Between two of these ridges lies the beautiful town of St. George. Doesn't that sound poetic? Where 9 years ago was only a sandy shot of mineral ground watered by a few brackish springs. The first way to counteract this wilderness, those brackish springs, was to lay out their cities in neat, orderly blocks, regardless of how the topography worked. The plat of the city of Zion, as created and carried out in Utah, was as ordered and rational as they come. Every town was laid out with a public religious building in the center. Orderly business districts are immediately around the center with homes laid out in the surrounding blocks. Farmland, which by its very nature seems a little more chaotic, was at the edge of town. This order meant that with the decade of settlement, everything was clean and tight and contained. So in the early 1870s, Elizabeth Kane visited St. George. She and her husband were non-Latter-day Saints who were very good friends with Brigham Young. and they were given special access really to Utah. And she traveled the state with her husband in company of Brigham Young. And when she got to St. George, this was her description. The streets of St. George are smoothly graded wide lanes. Water murmurs along the edges of all the side paths, which are overhung with trees. Vineyards and orchards surround these houses, and there are so many birds about that Evan, who was her son, said the cottonwoods seemed to have budded out in blackbirds. Imagine if they had spent the first 10 years figuring out what kind of landscape they wanted. Elizabeth would not have written that kind of description. This ordered rationality in the landscape continued in what was chosen to name the streets and towns of early Utah. Those classic Utah street names of First East, Third West, 106 South, are all markers of order and rationality imposed on the landscape. You're not going to find a huge variety of street names in Utah. Some neighborhoods in early Salt Lake were given street names of fruits and trees, but it was incredibly rare to see a street named after a person, with the hierarchy that implied. It was also more rare in early Utah to see towns named after English or New England towns. Occasionally it happened. You get Leeds in southern Utah, for example. There are some examples of ancient names like Manaway, Mantua, if you want to be Italian, we just Mormonized it, it's fine. Near Brigham City. Far more common in early Utah are towns named after local explorers like Provo and Ogden, Native American tribes, leaders, or words like Kanosh and Parowan, and even Book of Mormon references like Lehi and Bountiful. They are imposing their own rationality instead of importing irrationality to this landscape. Early settlers occasionally threw in names of their own leaders like Brigham City and St. George, but those are a little more rare. Another possible motivation for classicism is a desire to connect with the feeling of age. It must have been disconcerting for many of these people that have come from some cities and towns that have been around for hundreds or thousands of years into this new place with seemingly nothing in it but sagebrush and more sagebrush. One way to feel settled is to build something that feels old, a sense that we will play at being old and established while we start over in this new landscape. And this sense could occasionally manifest as a sense of nostalgia for the past. One example for me of this nostalgia is the St. George Tabernacle. Construction of this sandstone meeting house began in 1863, a mere 18 months after they arrived in St. George, under the direction of church president Brigham Young and church architect William Folsom. In 1862, Erastus Snow, who was an apostle and leader of this new southern Utah settlement, wrote to Brigham Young asking for direction on their new meeting house as construction was about to begin. He wrote, Brigham, we would like your suggestions on the size and style of the meeting house, as well as the material you would choose. We contemplate, if you approve, building it on the public square, not far from the present site of our Bowery. But we have not determined whether to adopt a flat ceiling, a full arch, like the Salt Lake Tabernacle, an arch through the center, and the building to have galleries after the old Gentile style, a circular building having a dome, or some other style. What do we do? Do you guys hear the architecture kind of debate? What do we do in this new place? What will be our style? We don't have Brigham's response, but it is clear that the old Gentile style won the discussion. The St. George Tabernacle has hints everywhere of federal. This feels like a New England town church. This could be Presbyterian. This could be Episcopalian. Transplanted it into this landscape. It is old, but old to America. So the idea would be that our young people who are born in this landscape and in this wilderness will be reminded of the type of places that we came from when we joined this faith and moved to the West. But of course, it had to be adapted because you can't just pick up Old North Church, drop it in the West and have it make sense. So they have to adapt to material, climate, access of goods. You know, there's no train even today to St. George. So you have to haul it there by wagon if you want it at all. And you have to deal with it in the heat. Classicism was extremely popular in the United States in the first half of the 19th century for many reasons. One of the most commonly given reasons for the popularity is desired connection with the great republics of the past in this new republic. Harkening back to an era when the ideals of democracy were fully realized would set America on the same path. These ideals were especially important in public governmental buildings, and two examples come to mind. First, the Salt Lake City Council Hall used to be kind of downtown Salt Lake. It's now up the hill by the state capitol building, and the Washington County Courthouse in St. George. The county courthouse, and these two buildings were built at about the same time, within about a year of each other, at opposite ends of the settlement. These two buildings epitomized Greek revival architecture in governmental buildings in early Utah. The ideals of democracy would play out in temples built to that purpose. There are strong similarities in these buildings with a few differences that may be attributed to the location they are built in. For example, the Salt Lake Courthouse, well, I think they're both stone. Yeah, they're both stone, but very different kind of stones. Many of the details of the St. George Courthouse are also found at the Tabernacle, likely because the carpenters were working on the same building. And if you have one set of knives, you're going to use that on every building in town. So the newel posts are the same. One's federal, one's Greek, it doesn't matter. The details in the cornice are the same on the Tabernacle and the courthouse. It doesn't matter. I've got one carpenter in town who knows what he's doing. The Salt Lake City Hall is a little more ornate, especially in the cupola, because access to materials and other goods required for construction were easier. There was a little bit more cash in Salt Lake. There was a little bit more food, and there were a few more people who knew how to build. Salt Lake in general was a little fancier because it was much easier to live there in St. George. You have to hunker down a little bit in the southern settlements in a way you don't have to hunker down in the north. It is interesting that while the United States looked to classicism for their architectural ideal in the mid-19th century, the English were looking more to the recent past. A nostalgic wave for the romanticized medieval world swept England with major influence from John Ruskin and others. That nostalgia for the medieval world occasionally transferred to the United States, and a few rare but significant instances made its way to Utah. So not classical, but absolutely needs to be mentioned if you're talking about early Utah architecture. The most famous example of this somewhat medieval past is the castellated Gothic Salt Lake Temple. This temple feels ancient, but in a very different way than its contemporary classical buildings nearby, even those designed by the same architect. While the spires reach heavenward like a cathedral, the battlements give a sense of defense and protection like a castle or other fortification. Nothing about this temple is purely Gothic, but it implies nods to the medieval religious world. The Gothic style reinforces the different purpose of this building as holy space compared to tabernacles and courthouses that were more public, kind of gathering community spaces. The ideals of classicism as they appeared in 19th century America were far more romantic than the reality of ancient Greece. None of us want to live in an ancient Greek house. Greek revival domestic architecture of the 19th century would indicate that everybody lived in a temple, and that cities were neat and orderly, and the Greeks were rational all the time. It didn't matter what the reality of life was in the 5th century BC, because what mattered was how it perceived and how it was perceived and how we modified it to fit the narrative of the world that they wanted to create. No one walking up the Salt Lake City Hall would say, wow, that looks just like the Parthenon. But everyone would understand the connection to the ancient world that was implied. So how did we do this? How the ideals of classicism played out very widely across the country and in Utah. Two buildings constructed in the same style would look very different based on where they were built and who built them and the motivations for that build. A lot of this discussion is rooted in the theories of vernacular architecture, vernacular building. Vernacular buildings, if you haven't read anything by Thomas Hupka, you need to go read all of Thomas Hupka. He's fantastic. Vernacular builders worked within the limits of their local tradition. Basically, a builder or owner will look around at existing buildings in their town. They would look at what they liked and what they didn't like. They considered what they were good at, and they were considered what they had absolutely no skills in, and they would consider the skills of everybody else around them. They considered what building materials were popular and that were easily available in the neighborhood. They would take what they liked from all of those different things and dislike them, to take out all the things they didn't like, and then basically put the things they liked in a big hat, shook them around, and see what comes out. The next builder would repeat that process, but he'd shake it up in a slightly different way. And so over time, vernacular buildings evolve because every architect, every builder puts their own little idea or spin on it. So what that means is that they're all Greek, but you can trace the activities of a carpenter through a town, because that carpenter has a certain set of knives for baseboards, and he's not going to buy a new knife because he knows how to he knows how to do baseboards. And certain stonemasons leave certain kinds of buildings. And so your skills and your expertise are going to vary widely from place to place. So most of the Greek Revival and Federal Revival building we're doing in Utah is based in these vernacular traditions. The toolkit of a vernacular builder was greatly enlarged by the creation of architectural pattern books. Especially skilled builders or architects wrote down their best knowledge and the rules of their style. They would tell you exactly how to form an arch, exactly how to form a column. Builders then would use these books as guides in designing their own vernacular spaces. Every aspect of design is covered in these books, from understanding the proportions of a building to the details separating the Doric and the Corinthian orders, as understood in the 19th century, not Palladian, a little more current. These books gave direction on how to design houses, how to design churches, how to design public buildings. They gave floor plans, elevations, interior details. Everything was covered in these books, and these books were immensely popular. Some of them went through dozens of printings. And so any good builder worth their salt would have at least 4 or 5 of these books they could draw on. The most popular designers of these designers in Utah were Asher Benjamin and Menard Lefevre. And I would love to do a study and track their details through Utah. So for example, so if all you had were the buildings in your town, you could then take that pattern book, right? And you would have another piece to shake up in that hat, come up with your design. So let me give you one example. Like I said, if you haven't done, as I'm aware, a systematic study of how these pattern books are manifest in Utah. But one of my favorite examples of their work in Utah is at the Beehive House, designed by a carpenter turned architect, Truman Angell, who was also designing the Salt Lake Temple at the same time. The Beehive House is one of the grandest Greek Revival houses in Utah, and it came from a pattern book. Some of it's Benjamin, some of it's Lefevre. He borrowed heavily on almost every detail, including the porch columns, the door profiles, the window trims, the baseboard heights. One of my favorite examples, the mantelpieces in the upper floor lawn hall are almost an exact copy of plate, I think it's plate 87 of one of Lefevre's pattern books. On the left is the plate from Lefevre's work. It's kind of, well, scanning isn't great. In the center is Angel's drawing for that fireplace. And on the right is the fireplace as installed today in the Beehive House. It's basically the exact same thing, every detail of it. The explanations of classicism as found in these pattern books cannot be underestimated for their influence in early Utah. So classicism, however, would play out widely in various parts of the country. So let me give you a few examples. And some of this is going to be who built it and where it was built. So perhaps one of the best known examples of classicism in the early United States is the University of Virginia campus designed by Thomas Jefferson. He went full on. He went, every detail you could think of is going to be found in the Jefferson building. And he can get away with it because he's Thomas Jefferson, right? Nobody's going to tell him, no, you need to bring it down a little bit, get rid of the dome. Just nobody's going to tell Jefferson not to do that. So his work really became the standard for high style ornate classicism in the early United States. And people in Utah can look at that and go, okay, I can take that form. I can take the pitch of the roof, and I can't do the dome, but I can put columns up. That'll be great. Another example, a little bit further north, so a different regional context, is Quincy Market in Boston, about the same age. But again, picking up on some of these ideals, right? The temple front, the symmetry, the way that the columns are working is all very representative of that classicist styles in the early United States, but playing out very differently in Boston. And a couple of smaller houses, thanks Google. The David Hageman house in Rochester, New York, I think 1840s, the kind of classic Greek revival house in early America. Temple front, nice clean symmetry, side entry. And you can imagine that the floor plan is going to be just as clean and symmetrical and balanced. Every detail is going to be playing out the same way. Another house in New York, and again, up here in Rochester, brick is easy to get, right? You have the Erie Canal, you have all kinds of industry coming. Brick is fantastic, it's going to work well. Another house in New York, again, kind of an early classicist, I think this is also 1840s building. Out of wood, because in this part, New York also has a lot of good building materials for trees. And this town probably had more carpenters, and Rochester probably had a few more stonemasons, and they could kind of work things out. So how does this look when you start going west? Well, Nauvoo, Illinois gives a couple of good examples. One of these is the Brigham Young home, built in 1842 out of brick, kind of Federal revival. And on the right is the Orson Hyde home, also built in 1842, but Greek and out of wood. So in Nauvoo, about, what is the percentage? About 10 to 15% of the houses were actually brick. That is the fancier building material. Everybody else is built, you're going to build a lot out of log, and you're going to try to build a lot out of frame. And then if you had more money, eventually you build your brick house. And so again, these are straight out of the pattern books. The column, the pilaster details on the Hyde home are straight out of Benjamin. And so they are hiring, so Brigham Young is a carpenter, so he's working on the house himself. Orson Hyde is not a builder. So he has to hire somebody to come in and build him his house. But it's possible because they have pattern books and they have things to bring with them. Classical buildings, so in the how of building, classical buildings in early Utah seem immensely restrained compared to buildings in other parts of the country. Benjamin and Lefebvre are giving examples of fully realized classicism that don't really ever appear in Utah. I can't think of a single Corinthian column in any building in Utah before about 1880, 1890. So unless Tom has an idea, and then I'll be corrected. So why the restraint? Why do we go simpler in Utah? Let me start first, though, with the grandest example of the Federal revival in the territory. This is the Utah Territorial Statehouse. So when the first legislative government was meeting in Utah, they decided that our governmental seat should be in the center of the state in Fillmore. And so Truman Angell was sent to Fillmore to design a federal building. And the original goal was to have 4 wings of this building with a big dome in the middle. And after 2 legislative sessions in Fillmore, they decided we're not doing this anymore, and they moved headquarters back to Salt Lake. And this building became more of a kind of a local governmental building. So again, all of the classic details, right, a federal revival, but in a restrained, simple way, because access to materials is so hard in this town, right? It's all out of Benjamin, but it's simple. So access to materials seems to be one of the biggest issues in Utah. Adobe becomes the primary building material for the majority of the state because it's easy to get and anybody can make a mud brick. You don't have to have a lot of special skills. But what it does is limit the size of your buildings. You cannot go, Jefferson big when you're building out of Adobe. So one of the earliest examples, this is the Bountiful Tabernacle, built in, I think, finished in 1863. This was built for all of the Latter-day Saints in Davis County. This was the main congregational hall for those saints. It has been added on to and remodeled multiple times. The top part of the steeple was blown off in a windstorm, I think in the 30s. And it was finally restored, I think in the 50s, 60s. And it's been rebuilt now multiple times because you have this little teetering wood structure on top of a teetering adobe structure. But again, all of the classic elements, right, of your Greek revival. You have a covered porch with your columns. That five-pointed steeple spire is out of one of those pattern books, popular in the 1840s. And it is a simple little structure, right? So you have 3 windows on each side, a raised platform at one end, a balcony at the back of the hall with Doric columns on it, unadorned, simple, but about the fanciest they could get. And then on the other end of the territory in the town of Virgin, another very simple little Greek revival meeting house. 1 room, again, 3 windows, raised platform on one end. You can't go full steeple, but we'll go enough of a steeple to get a bell in there, which feels very, you know, early American, you know, democratic, you know, poor brand new communities can't afford a bell, but we'll save up and Virgin will get a bell. And then necessity may have also played a big part in the simplicity of domestic architecture in early Utah. Getting something warm and functional often mattered more than size. You could take 10 years to build you a nice big warm, you know, gorgeous house, or you could take a season and have some place to live. Utahns built a lot of small homes using principles of these designs. They were neat and disciplined and orderly and fast. You could build a single cell, you could build a hall parlor, you could build a central passage, you could build 2-story. All of those varieties could come into play. So here's an example of a Greek revival house in Provo, the Clark Taylor house. I think the porch columns have been modified a little bit. Those are looking a little spindly. Gravity and the weight of history do amazing things to keep porches on the buildings. But all of the classic details, right? Return cornices, deep cornices, it's flat pitch gable roof. The chimneys are always at the top of the gables. And you can imagine inside is also that neat and orderly. Another example, the Covington House in Washington. This one is stone because you can get a little bit of stone a lot faster in St. George. And then you also have local adaptations, right? So again, you have the return cornices, the chimneys are all in the right places, the symmetry, the balance. St. George is so hot, you put covered porches on everything with balconies and all these things. So you could kind of deal with that heat exchange that is special in Southern Utah. Another house, the Reber House in Santa Clara. What makes this building interesting is that it was built by a Swiss resident. So they, instead of often bringing their other building traditions, right, the Swiss styles, Scandinavian styles, they're coming to Utah and they're quickly adopting the American styles, trying to come up with ideas that make us feel like we're local. We're not immigrants, we're not outsiders. We are part of this place. And again, all this, the kind of standard features you would expect. Another example in Beaver. I could just go on and on about Greek revival buildings. I really don't think we need to. And another one, the Allred House in Spring City. Kind of a great little 1.5 story. You could tell that at once upon a time it had a porch that has since been removed. If you're lucky enough to live in a town in an area that has good access to stone, like Spring City, like Sanpete County, you're going to get a lot of beautiful stone buildings. If you're unfortunate enough to live in Salt Lake, you're going to get a lot of adobe buildings because you don't have a lot of good stone options. Well, all the stones being used by the temple and Brigham Young, and you can't compete with that. Another example. So I showed you Orson Hyde's house in Nauvoo a few slides ago. Orson Hyde moved to Spring City, moved to Sanpete, and he built another one, but very different. Because again, in that vernacular tradition, he's looking around a town, he's looking at the skills of his builders. He's saying, I built a Greek one in Nauvoo, but I've got a different skill set out here. I've got different materials, I have more time. I'm gonna do a stone building and I'm gonna make it like 3 times as big as my house in Nauvoo. But still has all the kind of same details. And then another classics example, this is the George Mason House in Willard. Again, stone building, Willard's north near Logan. Yeah, and this one, whoever his carpenter was had a little bit more time to spend on his cornice. These guys had enough money, they got dentals, guys. Like they got full fancy on that cornice on that house, which makes me wonder what, does their interior window trim, did they get the, the gold plated version out of Benjamin and not just the budget version. How this plays out also is not just domestic architecture. What do public buildings look like? What do private enterprise buildings look like in these places? So a few examples. This is the Ephraim Co-op in Sanpete County. So another great stone building still standing. And again, has all of these classic details. And what I love about this one is that they took that federal kind of Palladian theme and gave it a good, solid Mormon twist. So it's hard to see in this picture, but in the top of it is, let me see, actually, if I can do it this way, right here, is the phrase holiness to the Lord and a beehive. Kind of classic symbols of Mormonism in the early part of these years. So they're incorporating, right, symbolic ideas of their faith with the ideas of the design world they're living in and coming up with classical buildings. And this is a store, this is a co-op. Another example, it's hard to believe that a factory could be Greek revival, right? This is the Washington Cotton Mill built. So part of the Southern Utah mission was to become self-sufficient. So St. George and Washington were founded in part for the growth of, they were going to try to see if cotton worked. Cotton never really worked in Southern Utah, but they tried really hard for a really long time. So this is the cotton mill, has kind of, again, classic Greek revival kind of details. There's just a little hint, kind of hard to see in this photo, hint of just a little return cornice, but because it's a factory, they're stripping out all of the ornament, but they're keeping the symmetry, they're keeping the regular rhythm and pattern in this building. And then you get a few really teeny tiny options. So if you go to Kanosh, you get this little tiny Greek revival temple front tithing office. This weird porch, all of that was added later, ignore all of that. This is just, but it's a really simple single room in the Greek style. So a tithing office. So in the 19th century, Latter-day Saints would give 10% of their income, and Latter-day Saints still give 10% of their income to their local congregation. But these were cash poor societies. So 10% of your income meant 10% of your grain, 10% of your chickens, 10% of your beef, right? So their tithing offices were actually places where you would come and bring your goods for tithing. And then those goods, if you had helped build the canal in town or help build the meeting house, you could go to the tithing office and receive payment from the tithes of the church for your living because you had helped on a church project. And so in many ways, right, these tithing offices are kind of symbols of this democratic kind of united utopian society they were trying to achieve. Everybody gives, everybody takes what they need, and everyone is equal. You give 10%, you get 10%. No questions. Another example, this is the Paradise Tithing Office. About the same time, Paradise is, again, northern Utah in Cache Valley. And again, very kind of classic little Greek revival detailing. This one's a little bit later. The window hoods are starting to lean a little Victorian eclectic. They're moving on to their next phase. But again, those ideals are still happening. So the strong symmetry and order of the exterior of these homes would continue into the interior of the homes as well. And I have two examples. The first is the Shepherd House in Beaver. So again, if you look at the exterior, great central passage, 2-story, all of the classic details of the vernacular Greek revival. You have a double parlor in the front, very symmetrical. And then the rooms in the back, if you take out these small dividing rooms.
You can minimize that.
Can I minimize that?
At the very top.
There we go. You drop that down to the bottom. You have, again, so you have 2 large rooms in the front with a central passage and then 3 symmetrical rooms in the back. So no matter how big or small you get, you want nice, clean boxes. curves are really hard to build. Squares are nice and easy if you're using hand tools. Machines change the whole world. So that's a simple example. Let me give you a slightly more ornate example. One of the houses that I'm working on right now actually is the Beehive House in Salt Lake City. Construction finished in 1854, designed by Truman Angell, who was church architect at the same time designing the Washington County Courthouse and the Salt Lake Temple. So he's kind of all over the place. So again, things get a little weird. It's Brigham Young. He's just going to have a good time. That you have, again, this kind of strong central passage house, 2 rooms on either side. This room was Brigham Young's bedroom. This room was the parlor, with working spaces and working rooms behind. Now, what I also find extremely interesting about this house is that Brigham adopted the style of the Greek Revival, but he also incorporated the floor plan and functionality of his childhood. So he built this house as the governor's mansion, right? So in 1847, Brigham Young comes to Utah. He is governor, he is president of the LDS Church, and he is Indian agent. And so in the Beehive House was the seat of government, the seat of democracy for the church. But it was also a working home. I kind of cropped it out just for the sake of the image, but he built in what we call vernacular architecture, a big house, little house, back house, barn. It was basically a connected Vermont house. And if you ever lived through a Vermont winter, you know how cold they are, and you will do everything possible to avoid having to go outside to take care of your animals or to get food or to do anything, because Vermont in winter is miserable, especially if you're living in the 1820s. It's just cold. And so this house had a connected barn, and then the kitchen and dining rooms. You kind of see in this photo, you have the connected barn here at the back, and then 2 rooms in the middle for the kitchen and dining room, and the big house, the fancy house in the front. So this is probably the most ornate Greek Revival house in Utah. All right, so you have a couple of courthouses. You have the Territorial Statehouse, those high styles, and then Brigham Young sets the architectural standard for Greek Revival in Utah. Now, I just need to acknowledge this, and there's this a whole nother lecture on its own. These ideals of classicism went into furniture as well. It's not just city planning, it's not just architecture, it covers every aspect of life. So this is a sofa that was originally in the Lion House. So this was built by one of Brigham's English furniture makers, a man named William Bell, in about 1860. And that's all I'm going to say about classicism and furniture. This is a lecture, this is a class. I nominate Josh Probert to teach that class about the evolution of furniture in early Utah. It gets way too involved. So I'm going to end. Well, why not use classicism? It was not the only option. Some preferred romanticism and a look into the more recent past, like I mentioned a minute ago with the Salt Lake Temple. A pattern book was available if you wanted that option. A.J. Downing popularized the Gothic Revival, which had some influence in Utah. The Gothic Revival most famously gained influence at the Salt Lake Temple. It also gained some favor at the St. George Temple at the end of the period that we're focusing on today. That's more late 1870s. A few other examples of Gothic to consider if you just don't want classicism. If you know, 8 of your neighbors have classic houses, you don't want to be yet that guy, the other guy who does another classic house. No offense to our classicists in the room. So let me give you a few examples. This is one of the earliest. This is the Staines Cottage in Salt Lake City. This is a Carpenter Gothic little cottage, popularized by A.J. Downing's book. When Brigham Young was deposed as governor, he didn't want to move out of his governor's mansion because he's like, well, I built it. I want to stay in my house. Plus it's 10 feet away from my other house. Why would I give that to the governor? So the Governor Cummings, moved into Staines's house. So moved into a little Gothic house. This house was across from what I will always call the Delta Center, across from Vivint Arena on 300 West and South Temple. Eventually, later owners built a second Empire building on one wing of it, and it became the Devereux Mansion. And then eventually they tore down Staines' little Gothic cottage and built the other half of the Second Empire House on it. So if you look really hard in the basement, you might see a little bit of the foundation of this fantastic Carpenter Gothic cottage. Another example, probably one of the most high style Carpenter Gothic houses in Utah. This is the Watkins House in Midway. Doesn't it just feel English and medieval? You know, you're gonna walk right out and say hello to the Queen, something. Brigham Young was a big fan of Carpenter Gothic himself. This is the Forest Farmhouse in Salt Lake City. It was originally on about 7th East and 2800 South, where I-80 is now. It has been moved, it was taken apart and moved in pieces to this is the place, Heritage Park, and is now bright pink if you need to go visit the Forest Farmhouse. Again, classic example of that style. And Brigham Young, interestingly enough, again, 10 feet from the Beehive House, built a Gothic house. So the Beehive House, like I mentioned, was his governor's mansion. The Lion House was, for lack of a better term, the family dorm. Brigham Young, famous polygamist, there were 26 bedrooms in this house. And so if you want your governor's mansion to symbolize democracy, you want your home, your family home, to symbolize religious, comfortable, serene family living. So on this family dorm, he imposed some Gothic ideals. Again, you have this deep pointed windows, the steep pitch in the roof, the little bit of castellations here on the porch. There's no way that is a classical porch. That's a castle to get into Brigham Young's house. And on top of it, he put that lion, the nickname, the Lion of the Lord. But again, that feels very medieval, right? You're gonna have statuary and sculpture on your home. So a few more examples of all shapes and sizes and varieties. This is the Powell House in Beaver, and thank you to Google Maps for this screenshot. Again, very simple, very vernacular build. It has all those kind of symmetry and order that you need if you have to build fast, but they put a little bit of fun in those upper windows. They just put a little bit of a gable in, just to make it feel a little more medieval. And then another one, this is the Edwards House in Willard. So even in the same town, right, you're gonna have Gothic example, a few Gothic examples, and a lot of Greek examples. So let me just kind of wrap up, and I think, I don't even know what time it is, how are we doing this? We're great. All right, so we asked, and then we can have some time for questions and commentary. So classicism is embraced in early Utah for many reasons. It was on trend, is the most popular style of the day. If you want to be in with the cool kids, you're going to do Greek. It's just what you did in the 1850s. But ironically, it's running out of style. If you listen to the purist, you know, like if you look at people who look at architecture as from this date to this date, this was the style. And after this date, nobody ever built in this again. Greek revival was out of style by the time they started in Utah. But in really the vernacular tradition, right, you're just going to keep going until it really runs out of steam. The classicism and reflected beliefs about the desire for fair, democratic, orderly spaces. It could be easily adapted and modified to fit the needs of the skills of local people. You could build it as one room with almost no ornament, or you could do all of the ornament in the world you wanted. From public buildings to hundreds of residents, classicism, for early Utah at least, seemed the language of home, and it seemed the language of life. New ideas and new challenges would continue to come up. The language of architecture responded to these new questions, these new challenges in new ways as the 19th century progressed. So by the time the 1880s arriving, they're dealing with classicism and other styles in entirely new and different ways, which is a discussion for an entirely other class. We could talk about Victorian eclectic for another hour. So that's all I have. Any questions, corrections, comments? There you go.
We have people here in the room. If you guys have any questions, or if we have any from our audience online, you can type them into the chat or unmute and go ahead and ask questions for Emily.
I have a question. On
Yeah.
some of the houses that you showed us, there was what looked like to be a door on the second floor. And just driving around some of the old houses in this area, I've seen that door before.
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with Greek revival or Gothic revival, or is that just a Utah kind of thing?
That is straight practicality, right? So the more, if you have a second floor, the more space you take up with a staircase, the less space you have for living, right? So you're going to get your hallways as tight as you can get it and your staircases as steep as you can get it because you want as much space in your tiny little house as you can get for living in. What that means is it is incredibly hard to get things to the second floor. So if you built this nice, big, beautiful bedstead, there's no way that is fitting up the stairs. And so a lot of houses would put doors in at that upper level so you could hoist things to the second floor. And then if you decided that you wanted a porch later, you could put a porch on your house and then that door becomes access out to the roof of your porch. So they're kind of start in practicality and then evolve as buildings evolve. It's a great question. Yeah.
You mentioned that classicism was an architecture that made us feel home.
Mhm.
Do you feel like that's still the case in the country?
That's a great question. I think that, I think the part of the thing is that as our world has become increasingly diverse, that people find home in lots of other places, right? So, so I mean, I grew up in a 1950s ranch house, kind of ranch rambler, and so I walk into one of those houses now, I'm like, oh yeah, this is my childhood.
Yeah.
Is it the style that I would pick for myself today? No, but that feels like home. So it's really interesting that for many of these people coming to Utah in the 1850s and 60s, they were coming from places and towns in New York and Illinois and England where classicism was really popular.
Yeah.
You don't find a lot of Italian members of the church, and you find even fewer, like none, like people from India or the islands, right, coming to Utah. So I'd be interested, I want to hear that question from how somebody from Hawaii would answer that. Does classicism feel at home to them because they're coming from a very different tradition, right? And than I am. So yeah, classicism, he feels like, I grew up surrounded by it. You go to school field trips at the Utah State Capitol. I went to prom at the state capitol. All those kinds of things feel home and homey to me. But I also love going to like my ancestral homes in Europe and totally different, and that feels at home too. So a very long answer of it's complicated.
Yeah, for sure.
And acknowledging the variety of traditions that we are coming from today. So great question.
Any other questions from here? We have one from the chat. Said, great job. I'd love to hear more specifically about why the settlers didn't stick with the style of the country they came from. What caused them to pick Greek revival, especially since it was quickly going out of fashion? Why did they choose not to harken back to their own heritage? You shared that one example of the Swiss builder. Any additional thoughts you want to add?
That's a great question. So how to describe it? I'd say almost, about half of the people moving to Utah knew how to build. They were already craftsmen and workers. So when you get looking at the place of origin, what traditions are they bringing, right? And do you want to leave your old traditions behind, or do you want to incorporate into this new place? And it's interesting because there are some examples. If you go to Santa Clara, there are a few more kind of Swiss examples of architecture. If you go to there are some log structures in San Pete County that are built using more Norwegian notching techniques than English notching techniques. So there are those examples out there, but I think it is really interesting that somewhere in the transition generally of leaving their country of origin behind, They want to fully adopt this new place that you're in. So you don't find, and it's strange that I don't think you find as many examples of other traditions in Utah as you would expect with how many Scandinavian and Swiss German immigrants you're finding in those early years. I think that starts evolving and changing later as more Victorian eclectic styles start coming in. You start seeing a lot more local regionalization and adaptation. But I think really in early Utah, it's, I want to be American. I want to feel local, you know. I'm going to learn English. I'm going to learn a new way of life. I'm learning a new faith. Let's go full in. Let's go lean in to the American ideal.
Do you know of any quotes or anybody who talked about Thomas Jefferson or the like Greek revival that was happening in the East Coast? That would be really interesting to know.
Yeah, I would like to say, I would love to really be able to dive into how these pattern books are being reflected.
How do we get funding to do that study?
Yeah.
Which of our students would like
Love to do that,
Right.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful.
That's a wonderful idea. And one thing I found really interesting, so in the early 1850s, Truman Angell is sent on a mission to England.
Right.
Brigham Young sends him. And this will horrify all of the architects in the room. He's sent on a mission to England to study the great architecture of Europe. You know, he's supposed to take his sketchbook, sit and sketch the cathedrals, and he gets over there and hates it. He would rather be out proselytizing and knocking on doors. The only building in England he even remotely liked was Hereford Cathedral. He's like, it's okay, kind of. London, don't even bother with those cathedrals in you know, they're just terrible. So so that's about, you know, that's the first architecture statement that comes to mind, is that Truman's like, I'd rather don't make me study buildings. But he was sent there because Brigham Young had been in England in 1840 and fell in love with it. And so he is being inspired, right, by these Georgian houses and by these great English Gothic cathedrals, and is trying to bring those ideals of architecture back to Utah. But I would love to see, I'd love to be able to trace these other architects, these other builders, and see what they're happening. So yeah, that's a great student paper, tracking pattern books in Utah and tracking who they're quoting and who they're ignoring and how that's really playing out. Yeah.
I really like how you tied the reason why these buildings look the way they are with the historical context that they were built in and the tools that they had. Would you say around the 1880s, like you were saying, that you kind of started going away from this, was there became like there was a new technology related to why the buildings changed?
Yeah. So remember, everything changed in Utah in 1869, right? So in 1850 or 1860 even, if you want it and they don't have it in Utah, you either have to make it yourself or you have to get in a wagon and go to St. Louis and then come back with it. That's really your option.
Yeah.
Right. And so everything is local. You're going to buy glass from outside of Utah and you're going to ship that in. And then you're going to, hopefully, if you can find a good source of iron, you can smelt your own metal here, but it's few and far between. So the train changes everything, right? Because now suddenly you can buy an entire house from a kit and drop it into the Utah landscape. And it takes some time for these vernacular architects to start making that transition. They start actually with ordering steam-powered mills, right? So that first technological change, you don't have to run everything by hand. Or like your baseboards are, you're not just a guy with a carpenter's plane getting that baseboard just right. You run it through the mill. You run it through that knife, and suddenly you could do a whole lot more board feet. And as soon as that knife is here, you can start getting a lot more ornate, which is how you start getting more kind of Victorian, eclectic, revival styles. Just when you have a machine that can do it, who cares how many different pieces of joinery you have to put that piece of trim together? And then the same thing happens with other materials, right? Starting, so like the roof of the Salt Lake Temple, for example, is made of Carnegie steel. So steel made in Pennsylvania, put on a train and brought to Utah. And you get the span of that roof because of a material that would have been impossible if they had finished that building in 1865. It would have been a wood roof. Right? Wood shingles would have been very kind of different. So yeah, steel, and then, you know, electricity, gas powered things, the technological revolution, when it finally hit Utah, went big. And the impact really starts going. So if you're on a train line, it goes big. If you're in St. George, you're going older styles later,
Yeah.
because materials are harder to get down there. Great question. What else?
I think that's it. Let's give Emily one more round of applause. If you're here on campus, please stick around, have some food, come and meet Emily. And we hope everyone will join us for our next lecture, which is November 11th. It's at 11 a.m. So this is a change of time because it's going to be live streamed from Greece. Dr. Boletis is going to give us a lecture on the monument of Lysistrata in Athens. And we hope you'll join us then. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.